I think it's really interesting to think about why we do these things, why we misrecollect our past, how those kinds of reconstruction errors occur. And I think about it in my own personal life. I share my memories with my partner. And many of us who have partners, we have these sort of collaborative ways in which we recollect. But those collaborations often result in my incorporating information into my memories that were suggested by this individual, but I never experienced. And so I might have this vivid recollection of something that only my partner experienced because we've shared that information so often. And so that's how we can distort memories in the laboratory. We can just get individuals to try and reconstruct events over and over and over again. And with each reconstructive process, they become more and more confident that that event has occurred.
Anthropology is a holistic study of humankind. It studies all the aspects of human life, all geographic regions of all time periods, from its evolution as Homo sapiens to its diverse manifestations within cultures and societies, both past and present. Since recorded history, people have sought answers to such far-reaching questions as who we are, how have we come to be as we are, how can diverse peoples coexist peacefully, and what might the past and present tell us about our future? Anthropology seeks to answer these and many other fundamentally humanistic questions. Anthropology employs both qualitative and quantitative research methods within its numerous subdisciplines. Common to all anthropologists is method of fieldwork. A physical anthropologist may observe wild or captive primates or dig prehistoric sites to discover clues about humankind's origins and early migration patterns. An applied anthropologist plays games with disadvantaged schoolchildren to advise school administrators on how to create conflict-reducing after-school programs. A socio-cultural anthropologist may live in a hut among tribal communities to learn the meanings of their unique rituals and political economy. A linguistic anthropologist interacts with native language speakers at a family function to discover clues to their cultural retention amidst globalizing society. Within each of these and the myriad other ways and places, anthropologists conduct day-to-day research to benefit humankind. Although wind power plants have relatively little impact on the environment compared to, say, fossil fuel power plants, concerns have been raised over the noise that is produced by the rotor blades, visual impacts, and death of birds and bats that fly into the rotors. This is termed as avian or bat mortality. Like all mechanical systems, wind turbines produce some noise when they operate. Most of the turbine noise is masked by the sound of the wind itself, and the turbines run only when the wind blows. In recent years, though, engineers have made changes in design to reduce the noise from these wind turbines. Early model turbines are generally noisier than the most new and larger models. As wind turbines have become more efficient, more of the wind is converted into rotational torque to drive the motor that produces electricity, and less into acoustic noise. Additionally, proper sitting and right selection of insulating materials can help minimize noise impacts. Unlike most other generation technologies, wind turbines do not use combustion to generate electricity and hence don't produce any air emissions whatsoever. The only potentially toxic or hazardous materials given off are relatively small amounts of lubricating oils and hydraulic and insulating fluids. Therefore, contamination of surface or groundwater or soils is highly unlikely.
I believe listening skills need to be both taught and practiced. Just because you have a pair of ears does not make you a good listener. You can certainly hear things and hear what is spoken to you, but listening is a whole world apart. I must advise you to use what is called effective listening. The very first step of effective listening is tuning in. A good listener must be physically and mentally prepared to listen. One must practice focusing on what is being said with undivided attention. This means that you should forget all the little or even not so little things which come into your mind and focus entirely on what the person is saying. A lot of times, people experience absent-mindedness. They begin to listen to someone speak, and in the course of their listening, random thoughts start invading their minds. This is actually a very normal thing. But the key is to not give your attention to those random thoughts. When this happens, you tend to forget the person who's speaking. What also happens is that we get too focused on listening for the important points, particularly in a lecture, and then make the mistake of not getting certain key details or minor points which can be important to know. What is not said sometimes is just as important as what is being said. I'm making a reference, of course, to inferences. Those are things which are not said, but can be deduced or suggested from what the speaker is saying. A good listener needs to halt judgment and wait until the other person is finished before contemplating what is being inferred or not, as well as to know what is relevant and not relevant.
The aurochs. The aurochs is the ancestor of cattle and is extinct wild cattle that inhabited Europe, Asia and North Africa and died in the forests of Poland. It was dark in colour. The bulls had a light eel stripe along the back and the cows were lighter in colour. They also had uniquely shaped horns. In the 13th century, the aurochs were limited to Europe and later became limited solely to royal households because they became so rare due to extensive hunt. At one point it was illegal to hunt aurochs, and this crime was punishable by death. The last of aurochs was a female, which died in 1627 from natural causes. Anyway, the punishment did not make any effect on the improvement of the aurochs population.
Although there was a big problem there, I believe. The population went up to about 400 in the 11th century, and then illegal hunting took place. The population crashed again, and the programs that were instituted to preserve them were restarted. That was successful for a while because at one point there were several hundred in the wild.
In whatever way the Civil War in America is viewed, it ensured that the future condition of the colored race in the country would be settled for all times to come. Had there been no slavery, there would have been no war. A desire for a separate confederacy was the final cause. Yet had slavery not stood in the country, there would not have come into being that peculiar state of society which lived in the southern states, and which demanded for its very existence that it should rule alone. Slavery had created an aristocracy, not of numbers, but of wealth and power, which bore with all the social forces. While the slaveholders were but a very small minority of the whole people, yet by the force of their wealth and the fact of their being slave owners, they held all the political power, and indeed swept out of existence any opposition. There were, with very rare exceptions throughout the whole South, but two classes, free and slave, or may we say, slaveholders and slaves. For the non-slaveholders were completely lost. They worked in and with it, and were indeed a part of it. Anything which struck slavery struck at the root of this power.
Now, for better or worse, we live in a world profoundly affected by Sigmund Freud. If I had to ask you, name a famous psychologist, the answer, most of you, would be Freud. He's the most famous psychologist ever, and he's had a profound influence on the 20th and 21st century. Some biographical information: he was born in the 1850s. He spent most of his life in Vienna, Austria, but he died in London, and he escaped to London soon after retreating there at the beginning of World War II, as the Nazis began to occupy where he lived. He's one of the most famous scholars ever, but he's not known for any single discovery. Instead, he's known for the development of an encompassing theory of mind, one that he developed over the span of many decades.
Now, Katrina was perhaps the strongest hurricane that hit the American coast in recent times and was significant for several reasons. But first, I'd like to provide some basic information. For one, it was classified as a Category 5 hurricane, which means that it was extremely powerful, with a great destructive force as evident by the news reports. Katrina affected the majority of the Gulf Coast of the United States, causing catastrophic destruction. For example, the city of New Orleans, as well as other cities along the coast in its path, were destroyed. Now, its damaging trek began on August the 23rd, 2005, when it originated as a tropical depression near the Bahamas. The next day, the tropical depression strengthened to a tropical storm and was named Katrina, and it proceeded to make landfall on the southern tip of the U.S. state of Florida as a minimal hurricane.
Welcome to today's lesson. We are continuing with our study of taxonomy. Taxonomy is how scientists classify organisms into different groups based on the characteristics that they share. So, for instance, a good way to think about taxonomy is the U.S. Postal Service. If we want to send a letter to someone, we first start off by addressing it to the nation they're in. By default, we usually assume that's America, but it doesn't have to be. It could be England or Costa Rica or Spain. You put their nation or their kingdom. Then within that kingdom, you address it to a slightly more specific level, their state. So for instance, South Carolina would be the same as a phylum. Then within that state, you would address it to their city, and then to their street number, the street they live on. Then you would address it to, say, their apartment complex, and within that complex, you'd address it by their last name to their family, and then finally their first name to the specific person you want to get it to. And in that way, we're able to weed out all the 400 million people we don't want to send our letter to in America and pinpoint the exact person we want the letter to reach. And in the same way, scientists use a taxonomy chart to pinpoint a living creature, an organism, and how it relates to everything else in the world.
At the top, you would have a king. Now, the king would rule over a kingdom. Now, this is not so easy to govern, especially during the Middle Ages, and the king might owe many people things, especially people who helped the king come to power, helped him depose the previous king or to conquer this land. And so, in exchange for that, and to help govern, he might grant land or fiefs to other people. And the key currency in the Middle Ages under the feudal system is land, and land in exchange for loyalty and service. So this whole thing is a kingdom. Now right over here, this is a duchy. And a duchy will be controlled by a duke. I guess they didn't call it duchy because that just doesn't sound as serious. So the king might grant a duchy to a duke, and in exchange, the duke would provide loyalty, pledge their fealty. If the kingdom is threatened, the duke will fight alongside the king, would provide their own troops. If the king wants to go conquer other territories, same thing. And also provide the king with taxes, which might be in the form of coinage, depending on what time and region we are in the Middle Ages, or it might be in the form of a percentage of the agricultural production from this duchy.
A new study of fish called sticklebacks shows that shy individuals actually prefer to follow fish that are similarly timid. Researchers had trios of sticklebacks with known personalities play follow the leader. The fish were placed in a tank that had some plastic plants at one end and some food hidden at the other. In some of the groups, a bold fish and a shy fish acted as leaders, while another shy fish followed. And in other groups, it was a bold fish that did the following. The researchers recorded whether the follower sallied forth more frequently with the fish that was behaviorally similar or the one that was different. What they found is that shy fish were more likely to emerge from under cover when an equally wary fellow was already out there. Bold follower fish did not seem to care as much which leader they followed. Of course, no matter which fish a stickleback chose to stick with, the bold fish did lead more joint expeditions over the course of the experiment than their more retiring friends. That's because the bold fish initiated more trips, regardless of who might be tailing them. The researchers write that when offered a choice of leaders, sticklebacks prefer to follow individuals whose personality matches their own. But bolder individuals may, nevertheless, be able to impose their leadership, even among shy followers, simply through greater effort. We may soon see if such tendencies also hold true in humans.
Concrete was used in Rome from the early 2nd century BC on, but it was not until the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 1st century that the expressive possibilities of concrete began to be fully realized. Concrete, I think this is also important to mention when you think about concrete construction in relationship to stone construction that we've already discussed. Concrete is not cut or quarried the way stone is. Concrete is cast in molds. Concrete can be cast in any shape, at least any shape that a carpenter can build with wood. And like modern builders, the Romans erected wooden frames for their walls and ceilings, and they poured concrete into those wooden frames. What's most important for us in the context of this lecture and in this course in general is that the introduction of Roman concrete into Roman architecture freed the Roman architect from the confines of a rectilinear architecture that they had inherited from the Greeks, the kind of rectilinear architecture that made up a temple like the Temple of Portunus. This is a very momentous change and one that will have a lasting impact on the buildings of the Romans.
Basically, what I'm going to do is tell you that evolution can be either adaptive, in which case it has been driven by and shaped by natural selection. It can be neutral, in which case it's been dominated by drift. Or it can be maladaptive. So evolution does not only produce things that work well. Evolution produces things in which stuff can go wrong, and sometimes evolution just wanders around. Now, adaptive evolution is not about the survival of the fittest. That is a phrase invented by Herbert Spencer in the 19th century that has had a long shelf life, and it's wrong. Adaptive evolution is about a design for reproductive success. It's all about how many children and grandchildren you have, and whether you do it better than somebody else that's in the population. It's always relative. Natural selection is like the tale about the Buddhist monk and the disciple who were attacked by the tiger, and the disciple says to his master, "Oh master, we're going to be killed because we cannot possibly outrun the tiger," and the master says, "No, I just have to run faster than you." Well, selection is always relative. It always depends on what the picture is of reproductive success in that population at the time that it's happening.
Now, we spend a lot of time thinking about how climate will affect crops. But crops affect climate themselves, and they do this in two ways. First of all, about 1/4 of the land surface is used for growing crops. Another 10-15% are used for pasture. So a substantial amount of the land surface is used in crop and agricultural production. And how we use that land affects our climate. If we were, for example, to deforest a substantial area and replace it with an annual crop such as soybean, then we would alter the characteristics of the land surface, alter the way that water and heat flows from the land surface to the atmosphere and back, and ultimately change the regional climate if there's a large enough change to the land surface. So this is an absolutely fascinating topic, and one that's really quite difficult to understand because of the complexity. It's difficult because it needs us as crop scientists to work even more closely with our climate scientist colleagues. And it's difficult because we have to join our models together.